I'm delighted to introduce Professor Lisandro Claudio from the University of California at Berkeley, known to me and to probably many of the others of you as Leloy Claudio. I will say a few words about him, but I'll try to be short so that we can give the time to him. Professor Leloy, as I'm taking the liberty to refer to him at the moment, is an exciting and yes, young historian of modern Southeast Asian history, specializing in the Philippines. He has a broad interest that include, among other things, biography, historiography, 20th century politics, the analysis of modern thinking and political ideology, which we could call intellectual history. And of course, he's deeply involved in contemporary popular culture and media across the region. His reflections on many of these topics will be included in his SEASSI lecture today. As noted, Professor Claudio is young, but if we assess his current contributions to his scholarly fields, he resembles a more senior scholar. When I occasionally refer to him as the new kid on the block, sorry, Leloy, for that, I am considering I am not considering the impact of him on the field, but only his age, which I do not wish to reveal at this moment. Okay. He is a native of the Philippines. In fact, he's a Tunay na Tagalog. He's from the Tagalog region and speaks Tagalog fluently, and many of his broadcasts and YouTube things are in Filipino and English. He did his undergraduate studies as a communications major at the Ateneo de Manila University, where he was the valedictorian of his class. He then went down under and completed his PhD in Asian history at the University of Melbourne in 2011. And I like to say only 10 years ago. He then returned to Quezon City as an assistant professor at the Ateneo de Manila University for 3 years before accepting a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies in Kyoto in Japan. From 2016 to 2019, he also held postdoctoral posts, professorial posts, at the Ateneo de Manila University and De La Salle University in Manila. Since early 2000, Dr. Claudio has been an assistant professor in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, where he currently teaches. I'll say things about his contributions to the field at this point. Since 2010, Professor Claudio has produced an impressive number of provocative and insightful journal articles and book chapters. I will not go through this list at this time, but will instead focus on his 4 major books. His first book, published in 2013, emerged from his dissertation and was published by the Ateneo de Manila University Press. The title was Taming People's Power, the EDSA Revolutions and Their Contradictions. This book was the winner of the Virginia Morallow Award for Social Science. And I might add, I knew Virginia very well. She's one of the outstanding sociologists of the Philippines, and this prize was named after her. His second book in 2017 was published jointly by the National University of Singapore Press and by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto. The title here was Liberalism and the Post-Colony, Thinking the State in the 20th Century Philippines. This book won the prestigious Cahen Prize given by the Association for Asian Studies for the best Southeast Asia book of that period. He is also the author of a book entitled Jose Rizal, Liberalism and the Paradox of Coloniality, published in the series of the Palgrave Macmillan series called Global Political Thinkers, and this book came out in 2018. Along the way, he had more fun. He also published a compendium of his popular commentaries from various newspapers, magazines, and online presentations under the title of Basagan ng Trip, translated in his own work as Killing the Vibe, subtitled Complaints on Philippine Culture and Politics, published in Manila or in the Philippines by the Anvil publishing company in 2016. This, of course, led to a series of popular YouTube presentations focused on media and political controversies related to the Duterte presidency, which you can all go online and find very easily. In addition, Professor Claudio is currently producing, and this is quite an exciting project, a 15-part history of the modern Philippines, a project sponsored by Rappler, the popular online media outlet based in the Philippines. The project will consist of his interviews, podcasts, with historians specializing on different aspects of this history to provide an innovative and accessible source for students, teachers, and the general public. Today, Professor Claudio will give us his lecture entitled A Research Agenda for the Study of Southeast Asian Liberalisms. We welcome him to our forum and look forward to his lecture.
Many thanks, Mike, and many thanks to SEASSI for everyone involved. And I should say that, of course, two of those episodes of that podcast hopefully will be featuring Dr. Mike Cudlin. If I can finagle him to do another episode, which I think maybe I can. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Give me a minute. There you go. Can everybody see my presentation?
Looks good.
Yep. Okay. So this is based on a paper that is forthcoming with the Asian Studies Review, and I've condensed it for you and sort of picked out all of the highlights. If you want a copy of the draft, please send me an email. I can send it to you. It's been copy edited, so it's more or less what you'll see in the final version. But let me give you a summary today and we can discuss it. So most general overviews of liberalism ignore Asian contributions to its development. Such Eurocentrism is understandable in works written by historians of Europe and North America who focus on the major sources of liberal thought in the 18th and 19th centuries. Scholars of Southeast Asia, however, have produced work that explicitly or implicitly examine liberal thought. Let me cite a few. The Philippines, because of its explicit liberal tradition, has been the subject of many books on liberalism and the Enlightenment. Here I'm thinking of works such as those of Risil Mojares, and this is the research area I have focused on in the past few years as well. In Thai studies, you have the work of scholars and historians like Patrick Jory and Thomas Larson, who have looked at liberalism and republicanism existing alongside while also challenging Thai royalism. In Vietnam, my colleague Peter Zinnemann has been writing amid what he calls a broader republican turn in Vietnamese studies. And in Malaysian studies, this is a bit of an older work. Anthony Milner has written about turn-of-the-century liberal writers in the Straits Settlement who challenge notions of kerajaan, which he views as a kind of ancient regime of feudal rulers. I would also like to note that a number of classics in Indonesian studies may be read as liberal defenses of parliamentary democracy during the Republican Revolution and the immediate post-independence period prior to Sukarno's guided democracy. And here I'm thinking about authors such as George Cahin and Herbert Feith. So that's Cahin on the left and Feith on the right, looking very much the part of mid-20th century liberal scholars. The study of Southeast Asian liberalisms is likely to grow in the coming years for a number of reasons. First, the rise of global populism and authoritarianism impels scholars to champion liberal principles like universal human rights. Second, a new generation of Asian studies scholars who are not raised on the left-right dichotomies of the Cold War are coming to rediscover more ambivalent political movements like those led by liberals. So I count myself as one of those. My parents' generation, the Philippines, they were communists and they were anti-Marcos, and that's kind of a dichotomy, right? Whereas for me, I don't have to live with those dichotomies. So I feel like I can explore these gray areas a bit more. And as you'll see, I consider liberalism and the ultimate capacious but beautiful gray area. So this lecture has two related goals. First, it briefly sketches a research agenda for Southeast Asian liberalism by making explicit the assumptions that subtend the work above or cited above. Second, and more substantially, it addresses methodological/ethical/political claims that, to my mind, create obstacles to the sympathetic study of liberalism in the region. In this regard, I address three obstacles. First, that liberalism is an elite project or that it's elitist. Second, that liberalism is detrimental and ill-suited to Asia. And third, that liberalism is emotionally barren. In the process of addressing these obstacles, I seek not only to defend a research agenda, but to point out possible areas of growth. So I'm going to work on a kind of dialectic where I introduce my agenda, I look at the critiques, and I see what we can say after those critiques. But before that, the definition. My definition of liberalism has three attributes. First, all liberalisms, not just in Southeast Asia, stand in opposition to forms of absolute authority or tyranny. In this sense, liberalism has always focused on rights and freedoms. The paradox of liberals, however, is that unlike anarchists, they believe that absolute authority can be curbed through authority as well, namely the authority of the state. A second attribute of liberalism, therefore, is its tendency to promote governance systems that balance rights. In this sense, liberals do not just promote liberty, they promote an ordered liberty through institutions and the rule of law. So that's the second attribute, ordered liberty. In ordering liberty, however, liberals encounter various value claims from various constituencies. This leads us to the third attribute of liberalism, which is that it acts as a kind of modus vivendi in society. It's aggregating various interests, or the liberal aggregates various interests and concerns. I believe that all the works above, in one way or another, implicitly or explicitly, discuss liberalism within these broad parameters. And more importantly, I believe they do so from a sympathetic lens. The research agenda I am defending and constructing here, therefore, is one that sympathetically looks at movements, individuals, and ideas in Southeast Asia that promote rights, ordered liberty, and a modus vivendi. So what are the possible objections to this vision? And what have been the objections to this vision? Objection number one, or obstacle number one, liberalism as an elite project. Any study of liberalism has to contend with the fact that many of its adherents have been elite state-building figures who preferred ordered liberty over revolution. In the post-war period in particular, many of the state builders in Southeast Asia were not radical proletarians, but privileged figures drawn from colonial systems of educations, and they were largely boring pencil pushers as opposed to romantic revolutionaries. This elite history of liberalism sits uneasily with historiographical impulses that emphasize a, quote, history from below. Since the 1960s, for example, historians of the Philippines have sought to promote a history that focused on lower class movements and mentalities. And here I'm thinking of classic works like Teodoro Agoncillo's Revolt of the Masses and Reynaldo Ileto's Passion and Revolution, which posit a kind of binary between subaltern revolutionaries and elite liberals who are out of touch with either class-based or millenarian politics. Now, though distinct from populist scholarship, the New Left scholarship of the 1970s also played a role in sidelining liberal scholarship. In Southeast Asian studies, New Left thinking informed a search for independent socialist thinkers who articulated localized Marxisms that challenged both capitalist imperialism and Soviet Stalinism. The best case study here is Benedict Anderson's Java in the Time of Revolution, possibly the most influential account of Indonesian nationalism, which decentered elite state-building figures like Sultan Syahrir, Prime Minister Sultan Syahrir, and Vice President Muhammad Hatta in favor of the independent communist Tan Malaka and his radical Pemuda or youth followers. Crucially, the historian of Indonesia, Anthony Reid, notes that Anderson's book grafted the campus politics of the United States onto his interpretation of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. To give you an idea of that grafting, look at this. In Anderson's world, figures like Syahrir and Hatta become kind of like the liberals that the youths were revolting against in campuses across the United States. They were described as rationalist, elitist, incapable of appealing to a mass public, and phlegmatic. Meanwhile, Tan Malaka was enigmatic and legendary, the one leader of stature who was fully committed to the policy of perjuangan or struggle, and the figure who represented a promise of a merdeka, freedom, close to Pemuda hearts. In the rare occasion where Anderson found fault in Tan Malaka, the romantic revolutionary, It is for a brief moment when Tan Malaka exhibited, quote, certain illusions about the real importance of formal institutions in the developing revolutionary process, end quote. In other words, Anderson is only critical of Tan Malaka for the times when he acted like a liberal, someone who believed that formal state institutions could create ordered liberty. The implication of arguments such as these is that any account of liberal ideas from political elites must be written from a safe distance and checked by research on other classes. For example, in a recent survey of works on Philippine liberalism and populism, the authors contend that, quote, a methodological focus on elite actors illustrates the limitations of liberalism's supposed predominance in the greater sections of the Philippine polity. They add that a top-down approach that studied liberalism must be complemented by a bottoms-up account of political attitudes and reactions in the post-colonial era. So it's a kind of different burden. When you're studying movements from the ground, nobody will ever say, well, that should be checked and balanced by movements from above. But if you're studying movements from above, the automatic critique that you get is, well, that should be balanced with movement from below. And what I want to say to this is that it is indeed easy to dismiss ideas from above and more politically acceptable among those within the non-liberal left to celebrate the view of the poor or segments of the lower middle class. Yet any study of Southeast Asian liberalism must be bold enough to confront liberalism's deep connections with elite thinkers and policymakers, even as these studies must insist that liberals can forge interclass solidarities. No idea is productive or correct simply because of its source. And the populist claim that popular ideas from below automatically deserve more attention will retard intellectual inquiry, and I argue even feed into a kind of political populism. That's something we can talk about in the Q&A. We should be able to judge, criticize, and celebrate ideas held by the masses, however you define that, in the same way we can and should be able to judge, criticize, and celebrate beliefs held by the elite, again, however you wish to define that. Scholarship on liberalism cannot escape the fact that many liberals have been elites. This field of study also has to accept that elite decision-making processes affect political change. So you can self-marginalize and say, I only study marginalized groups, but until you study people in power, you're not going to be able to understand how societies change, because societies change because of pressure from below, but also because of decisions of people in power. So it has to accept that elite decision-making processes affect political change, noting that these processes are not always cynical attempts by elites to protect narrow interests. But this does not mean that liberalism cannot be a subaltern discourse. In his fiction, for instance, Philippine national hero Jose Rizal posited that it is the poor who demand liberal rights like freedom from arbitrary arrest and punishment and property rights because they are the ones most subject to the caprices of authoritarian policing. Rizal's point becomes obvious when we consider that his poor 21st century compatriots are the ones most likely to die under President Duterte's war on drugs. In other words, under the caprices of an illiberal government. One can say the same thing about ordinary Burmese suffering under an illiberal junta. Nick Cheeseman, for example, sees a potential new politics emerging when, quote, people in Myanmar gather to insist that land stolen from underneath them be returned, when someone being dragged in handcuffs from the courthouse demands justice, or when a letter signed by an aggrieved citizen urges the president to make good on his commitments to the rule of law, end quote. These are cases where partial liberalisms emerge because of the repressive systems in the region. Liberal scholarship can therefore fish out liberalism from below. I mean, we fished out anarchism from below in the case of James Scott. We fished out socialism from millenarian movements in the case of Ray Leto. Surely we can fish out liberalism from today's context, wherein a lot of people are suffering under illiberal governments in Southeast Asia. So let's look at, which brings us to obstacle number 2. Liberalism is detrimental and ill-suited to Asia. The overarching goal of post-colonial theory, explains the social critic Vivek Chibber, is to purge social theory of its Eurocentric bias and to dismiss Western theories as imbued with said bias. As a result, Chibber argues that post-colonial theorists have dismissed Enlightenment philosophies like socialism. Chibber is no doubt correct to posit post-colonial theory's vexed relationship with socialism. Yet compared to liberalism, another philosophy of Enlightenment vintage, socialism has not been as ignored or vilified. Communism's opposition to colonialism gave socialism a certain cachet among Asian liberals in the 20th century, something that cannot be said for liberalism. Thomas Larson of Cambridge, for example, notes that Marxist thinkers often feature prominently in accounts of Thai intellectual history. And here we think of the terrific work of Craig Reynolds, for instance, but accounts of liberals are strikingly absent. Perhaps the most prominent post-colonial critique of liberalism is that of Uday Singh Mehta, who showed that British liberals like John Stuart Mill supported the imperial project in India. And those are, in fact, quite scathing condemnations of liberalism and quite persuasive. Apart from the post-colonial critique, there is the related anti-liberalism of those who promote the discourse of, quote, Asian values. A version of this thinking which contends that communitarianism has worked better in Asia than atomistic liberalism has historically been the script of authoritarian politicians like Dr. Mahathir or Lee Kuan Yew, but it has recently found a strong academic version in Southeast Asian studies in sociologist Cho Beng-Wat's 2017 book, Liberalism Disavowed. Cho's comprehensive account, and it's a kind of brilliant and articulate and comprehensive account, provides a context-specific analysis of Singapore's developmental path, arguing that the city-state's rejection of the, quote, atomizing tendency of liberal capitalism in favor of collective responsibility allowed it to become prosperous and cohesive. Now, to respond to the critiques about liberalism's inapplicability and lack of effectiveness requires making another crucial admission. Liberalism is indeed a deep Western and Enlightenment tradition. However, while it is true that much of liberalism's history, though not all, has been forged in the West, and that at times it has been ill-suited to Asian realities, there have also been periods when it has responded to the region's needs. And there have also been times when Asians themselves have taken up the mantle of liberal values, not for the West, but against the West, because the oppression that tyranny produces demands rights and freedoms. As Filipino diplomat and literary critic Salvador P. Lopez noted, liberal freedom has no nationality, for neither does tyranny. Thus, although scholars like Mehta are correct to posit that many Western liberals promoted colonialism, it is also true that Asian liberals objected to colonialism on liberal grounds. In my own work, for example, I've shown that liberalism was key to Jose Rizal's vision of anti-colonialism. Similarly, in the 20th century, Asian liberals, as shown in the work of historian Roland Burke, promoted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a necessary component of an anti-colonial third world movement in the Bandung Conference. So liberalism can be indigenized, and scholars interested in Southeast Asian liberalism have much room to explore how Southeast Asian activists and policymakers strategically deploy the language of liberalism in their politics. For example, they may wish to ask questions like, to what extent do movements critical of conservative Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia, or conservative Catholicism in the Philippines, deploy and adopt the language of liberal secularism? Or to what extent have members of sexual minorities in Southeast Asia appropriated liberal notions of tolerance and inclusion? Scholars of liberalism in Southeast Asia must also challenge the dichotomy between collective development and liberal rights, which anchor much liberal critique. Chua, for example, notes that the foundational institutional practices that have defined Singapore's success include state multiculturalism, an effective housing program, and a kind of state capitalism through state-owned enterprises. Now, these are indeed practices that have defined Singapore's success, and I'm not going to quarrel with Chua in that respect, but they do not require a disavowal of liberalism. In fact, these practices are central to European social democracy, which does not posit a contradiction between state economic planning and the protection of individual political rights. As historian Tony Judd notes, liberalism is almost impossible without social democracy because it is social democratic institutions that bind citizens to the liberal state. So broadly, therefore, we need to make the argument that communitarianism and liberalism are not two poles that are mutually exclusive. Communities may also exist in liberal societies because liberals may view themselves as part of broader collectivities. The risks in dismissing liberalism as foreign are real and tangible. In the Philippines, Duterte has demonized the foreign liberalism of his local and international critics to justify mass murder, thousands of people dead. In Indonesia, as my supervisor, Kate McGregor, has shown, President Joko Widodo's turn away from liberalism continues to stymie the efforts of human rights groups to seek historical redress for the violent killings of 1965. So liberalism must be judged based on its fruits and the values it upholds, and whether and if these values can curb the worst state excesses. And if they do, I don't think we should simply dismiss these ideas as foreign. So let's look at the final objection I wish to address, which is that liberalism is emotionally barren. The third objection is one that has not been as explicitly argued by scholars as the first two, but it explains why there is a relative dearth of material on Asian liberalisms. Other belief systems like nationalism, socialism, or even religion have clear conceptions of the subject and therefore draw individuals to communities of solidarity. Thais, Filipinos, Indonesians indeed belong to their national communities. The proletariat or the peasantry belong to their class, and the believer belongs to his or her or their religion. The liberal, on the other hand, belongs only to a system of beliefs about freedom and the regulation of political power. As such, the liberal subject is seemingly, and I must emphasize seemingly, abstract, and some argue even atomized. Political movements attached to specific subjectivities have been more extensively studied in Southeast Asia than liberalism, as a result, I suspect, of what I've argued earlier. Craig Reynolds argues, for instance, that scholars of Southeast Asia have mostly had a willingness to take the nation as a given and something worth fighting for and writing about. And indeed, many classics of Southeast Asian studies have been concerned with the emergence of modern nationalism. In fact, that's the class I teach. That's my graduate course that I teach every year at Berkeley. To a lesser degree, scholars of Southeast Asia have also documented the immense grip of socialism and communism over Southeast Asian activists and political thinkers. The rise of populist figures and movements impels us to consider the value of group belonging in animating political movements. For many populist constituencies, global forces like economic globalization and migration displace the centrality of old identities, and they view reassertions of race and nationality as necessary correctives to these forces. But if the power of modern-day populist movements rests on their ability to aggregate demands for identity, the revival of liberal democracy hinges on its providing a sense of belonging. People die for their countries, they die for their religions, they even die for their class-based movements. But who dies for liberalism? Most liberal democracies, argues Francis Fukuyama, are run by men without chests. Alas, many of them are indeed men, who spend their lives in the endless pursuit of consumer satisfaction, but who have nothing at their core, no higher goals or ideas for which they are willing to strive for or sacrifice. That was a quote. This is no doubt applicable to the study of Southeast Asia. Agoncillo's and Anderson's attraction to romantic figures like Tan Malaka and their aversion to bureaucrats discussed above no doubt stems from an implicit belief that it is men with chests that capture our collective imaginations. So can present-day liberals become men, women, or even non-binary individuals with chests? Can scholars of Southeast Asian liberalism find these people with chests? And can this research be done in a manner that provokes, incites, and yes, maybe even inspires? To conjure liberalism's elan, we may need to return to its origins. Today's liberalism may be bureaucratic and dull, pencil pushing, but that was not always the case. Prior to the ascendance of liberalism in the 20th century, prior to the ascendance of socialism, liberalism was the world's most prominent revolutionary tradition. a tradition that gave rise to two major revolutions of the 18th century, the American and French Revolution, and inspired and contributed to countless other revolutions. In the late 19th century, liberal revolutions spread to Asia when Philippine patriots launched the revolution of 1896. And then there were echoes of 19th century liberalism in 20th century Southeast Asian revolutions in Indonesia and even Vietnam. For there were other important nationalists apart from Ho Chi Minh's communists. We, of course, cannot return to the liberalism of the 18th and 19th century or the vestigial liberalisms of the early 20th century, because the revolutions of this period succeeded in reshaping political discourse. Liberalism is no longer insurgent, and it is now associated with the status quo, a kind of default operating system. And defaults, of course, are hardly exciting. But liberalism is not as well entrenched in Southeast Asia. And in this context, researchers may still interpret it as insurgent. Consider the burgeoning independent press in Myanmar, liberal Muslim intellectuals in Indonesia and Malaysia, the opposition to drug-related executions of Rodrigo Duterte, and an emergent regional LGBT advocacy network. All these movements have been influenced by liberal thought, and many of their members, though not all, would actively embrace the label liberal. Within their individual context, and perhaps that of the region, these movements are quite radical. In searching for liberals with chests, I've been inspired by a lot of research on Thailand. Thai intellectuals have also responded to military governance and state repression by articulating forms of political belonging that Thomas Larson identifies as liberal. In particular, Larson highlights the historian, and I'm going to butcher the name, Saishon Satayanurak's call for cultural reform, which advocates a plural notion of Thainess, equal protection, and the capacity of active citizens to challenge state power and the promotion of human equality and dignity. Recently, this incipient Thai liberalism has found an electoral vehicle, as you all know, in the form of the anti-junta Future Forward Party, which, according to its founder, aims to, quote, work both in and out of parliament to support democratic values, inclusivity, freedom, equality, and justice, end quote. Saishon's notion, as represented by Larson, of a flexible, plural form of national belonging hints at ways to think about liberalism outside cliched portrayals of it as atomistic, emotionally barren, and indifferent. At the same time, it also allows for a conception of human rights that restores it to its universal aspirations. If Tyrell Habercorn is correct to argue that the Thai state's cooptation of human rights discourse in Thailand stems from the simultaneous production of certain members of the polity as human and others as not fully human, then a liberal discourse of inclusive Thainess would restore the humanity and rights of certain subalterns. Saishon's vision is reminiscent of what philosopher Alan Ryan refers to as the non-stifling communitarianism that liberalism may engender. For Alan, liberals form communities because liberalism needs a community of liberals to flourish. Such a community would not simply be indifferent to differences among citizens, since liberal toleration, according to Alan, must rest on something more secure than indifference, or it will not last the first outbreak of temper and dislike. Ryan concludes that without a public opinion committed to the belief in the right to toleration, that toleration becomes insecure. Amid the various movements against unbridled power in Southeast Asia, we are seeing liberal communities promoting Ryan's non-stifling form of communitarianism. And studies of Southeast Asian liberalism should draw attention to these movements. So in conclusion, many of the objections about liberalism concern its provenance. Post-colonial theories are wary of liberalism's Western roots. Socialist and populist thinkers dislike the fact that it has been articulated by Westernized elites. We must, however, insist that the value of ideas should not be judged based on where they come from or the class of people who articulated them. Liberal traditions in Southeast Asia must be debated on their own merits and assessed based on their ability to secure democratic futures for polities in the region. Liberalism, both in the region and outside it, has surely had its discontents, and scholars must bear these discontents in mind. but they must also pay increased attention to the ways in which liberalism has been used to promote evergreen values such as human rights and the regulation of state power. This would not only allow liberals to ask questions about the future of Southeast Asian polities, it would also allow for a retheorization of global liberalism. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po.
Thanks for that great talk. We'll have some time for a Q&A now, so I invite you to put your questions in the chat, or if you want to ask directly, you can also raise your hand and I will ask you to unmute. So go ahead and take a few minutes to think of questions.
Hey, Lizzie, I can ask something.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Lalo and I have had an ongoing conversation about this for some time, and I don't want to dominate, but I'm kind of curious. So we tend to think of the liberalism that emerged in the late 19th century in the Philippines as being liberal and creating a series of liberal ideas. And we kind of assume that this was the leadership of the revolution. So that the revolution followed from this liberalism that spread in it. So, but in fact, we know that many people have written now that maybe it didn't. So among some of the theories, my own theory is that it comes more from the middle rather than from the educated, chestless elites who are liberals, or we have the argument of Reynaldo Ileto that it came from out of a cultural tradition that had developed over 200 years of Spanish rule. So I'd be interested in just your thoughts on, and this is kind of a reversal of conversations we've had before, is to kind of get your idea about the Katipunan. So the leaders of the Katipunan, kind of a two-pronged question. Were they from below or were they not? Or were they from above or were they not? That's one part. And the other thing is were they liberals, and what was their quest? If they were liberals, what was their quest for a society that would emerge subsequently?
Well, thank you, Mike. And as you point out, a lot of this is speculative because we can't interview them, which is what you told me, right? So, sorry. I'm actually working on a paper now comparing the supporters of Duterte with the Katipuneros who led the Philippine Revolution. And the argument I'm making is that these are two very similar groups because the supporters of Duterte are not poor, they're not rich either. They come from a kind of lower middle class. They are what Mike would call medio ilustrados or middle enlightened people, right? So if you look at the support base of Rodrigo Duterte, they are largely call center workers, people working in offshore industries in the Philippines, and they are products of new developments in global capital. Now, as Mike shows, the Katipuneros were very similar. They were in call centers in the Philippines at the time, but the equivalent was the kind of British or American office or warehouse. And those, like the call centers of today, those places were burgeoning in Manila and Cebu during that time, and they became the revolutionaries. So they're very comparable on the level of class, but also very comparable in terms of anger, right? They voted for Duterte because they were angry. They revolted because they were angry. But here's the difference. The liberals, the 19th century medio ilustrado, they were at the very least congenial to, they felt that they were congenial to the ideology of liberalism because they would at least cite liberal thinkers like Jose Rizal, and we know that Bonifacio, the leader of the revolution, would do that. So, this could be lip service. We don't know, but at the very least, they accepted the rhetoric and were willing to frame their revolution within that rhetoric. And we see this in the context of, and we see this in Jim Richardson's work on the kind of ideology of the Katipunan. So my question, and the question that's bothered me for a long time, is why is there a difference, right? Why does this lower middle class movement in the 19th century ostensibly support liberalism, whereas this lower middle class movement in the 21st century disdain liberalism, in fact, speaks actively against liberalism? So the reason why I think that's the case is because at the time, the division in society in the 19th century, the division in society was quite clear. It was everyone against the colonial administration. So it was easier to forge interclass solidarities between, say, the class of Jose Rizal, the kind of the high ilustrado, and the class of Andres Bonifacio, kind of lower middle ilustrado. And so there was that kind of capacious middle. Whereas in the 21st century, you already had that, what I talked about in the paper earlier, you already had that ossified upper crust liberal. So you can compare it this way. For example, somebody like Benigno Serviliano Aquino, the General Serviliano Aquino. We don't know to what extent his soldiers who came from the lower middle class and lower class loved him, but we know that people followed him to war, right? He was a general of the Katipunan. So that elite liberal could forge a kind of interclass solidarity with the classes below him. But his great-grandson, Benigno Aquino III, who was the president of the Philippines, could no longer do that. In fact, his liberal party was rejected electorally by the people who supported Duterte. So that's the kind of shifts in liberalism that I'm interested in, Mike.
And I'll just, if I may, just quickly add, is that the end of the revolution is also very telling in the Philippines. Like once victory, in a sense, the false victory is achieved and the Malolos Congress takes place, and the Katipuneros who win in this sense, as they begin not knowing yet exactly what the Americans are going to do, like attack, they call upon the liberal community to help them establish a government. In other words, they bring together the liberals of the earlier period who did not fight with them, and they call them together at that moment. I think that's a rather telling thing that you're already explaining in terms of that's not what would happen with the people who voted for Duterte, that they would sit down and call upon the faculty at UP to come help them establish a government. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I will add that to the paper if you don't mind. Thank you. That's an interesting, that's super interesting.
Thank you.
So I have a question in the chat from a participant and a comment. First, thanks for the overview of liberalism in Southeast Asia. The conclusion signals that Southeast Asian liberalism is rejected because liberalism is a Western project and Western projects should not be pursued. My question is, 1, is the West liberal? 2, has liberalism been successful for the West?
No, the West is not necessarily liberal because there are many Wests. The second, I think, liberalism, the question of liberalism's success is a difficult one because it's hard to measure success for liberals. So for example, for a communist, success is very straightforward, right? You take over state power and then the state withers, right? So you can measure the success. But liberals have never promoted a complete overhaul of society. So how do you measure success, right? If liberals have always been for partial changes or palliative changes that slowly ease the suffering of multiple people. So it's hard. So I think liberal success should be assessed based on the kind of modest criteria of liberalism to begin with. And in that sense, you can't say that liberalism has been a success. What you can say is that liberalism has had many successes, including things like, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States, right? The end of Jim Crow. Of course, that's still an ongoing struggle. But then that's why human history is always moving, because there are always changes that need to be made. Oops, sorry, you're muted.
Oh, thanks for that. I was just asking for any other questions that people might have. Oh, Eric Kitada, did you have a question? Here, let me just ask you to unmute.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I'm a PhD student at Rutgers, and I'm studying Philippine history and also the relationship among Japan, the US, and the Philippines. I have two questions. First is, why does liberalism has to be bounded by a national border in your presentation or in your paper? And to put it differently, why do you keep the national flame of nation for your analysis? And my second question is a bit long, but I'm curious about the second obstacle, including the critique by Uday Mehta. Though I have never read his work, Black feminist scholars have pointed out a similar thing, like supporters of liberalism in the West who are proponents of colonialism. And more strong critique is colonialism and Atlantic slavery were the foundation of enlightenment and modern liberal thought. So I strongly agree that liberal thought is never foreign to Asia, but to my understanding, liberalism has constantly needed the system of making hierarchies, and liberal thinkers don't argue in that way. So could you explain a little more why it's so important to state men in Southeast Asia who are also liberal?
Yeah, when it comes to national borders, that's largely because I know of very few studies that look at regionalism, at liberalism in Southeast Asia regionally. The exception is one really great article by Dirk Tomsa on the Council of Asian Liberals, and he looks at that as a kind of network. And there's one paper I want to write actually about regional parliamentary debating networks, because this is actually how I learned my liberalism. Because while I was a member of the Ateneo de Manila University Debating Society, I used to go to the Asian Championships, and there I would debate with other people from Southeast Asia, also from East Asia. And I found that because debating is a kind of, it's premised on free speech, it's premised on free exchange, that the people who gravitated towards debating were largely liberals. And now I find, for example, that a lot of the liberals that I knew in the debating world are now quite active. So one friend I had in liberal groups in Southeast Asia. So one friend I had in debating, he became an active member of Pakatan Harapan. I have in Malaysia. I have friends in Thailand who are now part of Putai, and some even part of Future Forward, right? And of course, a lot of us debaters in the Philippines became directly or indirectly involved in the Philippine Liberal Party. And we see resonances between what we're doing and what our old debating comrades were doing. And it's a kind of regional liberalism, incipient, but premised on really close ties between people who grew up with each other. So it's something I want to write about in the future, but I am looking for a co-author. With respect to Mehta, so the Mehta's argument is quite simple and actually quite empirically verifiable, which is that people like British philosophers who identified as liberals also supported colonialism. And my response to that is quite simple. True, we should acknowledge that. But I think it's also fair to acknowledge the fact that there were anti-colonialists in Asia who objected to colonialism based on liberal grounds. And my example for that is Jose Rizal, who defined his liberalism based on anti-colonialism. Why do we need liberalism? I hate to sound like Francis Fukuyama 2.0, but what really is the alternative to rights, right? What is the alternative to a system that allows for the protection of everybody's rights? And the stakes here are so high because the more people kind of denigrate liberalism, the more you're really feeding into the rhetoric of authoritarian people, right? That's what Jokowi is saying. Liberalism is not Indonesian. That's what Duterte is saying, right? So to counter them, you do have to make a kind of argument in favor of liberal rights, right? And my imagination is not as good as the imagination of other scholars, right? I cannot imagine a world that does not. I cannot imagine political systems that don't premise themselves on rights. Although if somebody's able to design that and implement that and it works, I'll be I'll be very open-minded to it. But at the very least, we should have a baseline of liberalism. So here's what I'm saying. The other thing I'm saying is that when you speak of liberalism as a kind of modus vivendi, you're not saying that it is the end all and be all. It's a kind of baseline of politics. Can we look at class difference within liberalism? Sure. Can we address racial inequity within liberalism? Sure. But there has to be that baseline of human rights and tolerance that we all consider as a no violation zone, so to speak.
Following question. So, like Lisa wrote a lot about, how can I say, a lot about indigenous people in Northern Luzon, and today we can see it as a bit or very racist. So, like, how can we understand that kind of complicated hierarchies and a relationship, and like how should we understand liberal thinkers in maybe not from today's framework, but I just want to know.
Yeah, to me, it's very simple. Liberals make mistakes, and liberals own up to those mistakes. I mean, we're always rehabilitating a lot of political ideologies, right? For example, everybody's rehabilitating Marxism in one way or another, despite the fact that many people who call themselves Marxists were imperialists and mass murderers, right? Stalin, right? So we can do the same thing with liberalism. Like, there have been many horrible liberals in the past. Doesn't mean that we cannot mine it for ideas that work today. And what I'll say about Rizal is, he was extremely racist relative to the Negritos. Absolutely true. But in his best moments, he also had lines like, my favorite line from Rizal is, some of us are Indio native, some of us are Chinese mestizo, some of us are Creole, but we all call ourselves Filipino. So what's that? That's a kind of post-racial way of viewing the Philippines. That is Rizal in his best moment. So, how do we assess Rizal now? Well, we acknowledge that this is a flawed man, but we also acknowledge that he had some good ideas, which is, for me, the kind of synthetic approach that liberals take, which is, take the good stuff, leave the bad stuff, continue experimenting. The solutions are never final. Just keep an open mind. Everybody's going to be partially wrong and everybody's going to be partially right. I think it's quite sunny, it's a smiley philosophy in that sense.
Great. So we have another question in the chat from Brioni Lau. Thanks for a fascinating talk. I'd be interested in hearing more about the connection between uncritical histories from below and the rise of populist politics.
Yeah, so, there is a kind of rhetoric, at least in Philippine academia, right, that says the worst thing you can be is elitist. So if you are, for example, dismissing the perspectives of people from below, that means you're wrong, you're evil, you're elitist, right? And you see that in the scholarship, right? You see that in the scholarship, for example, of the most prominent Filipino historian of the 20th century, Teodoro Agoncillo. And most of the time, I kind of agree with that. But there are certain times when actually, to be a liberal, you have to be elitist. And I'll give you one example. In the Philippines, 92% of people support Duterte. Around 60% of those people support him, while at the same time saying that Duterte is committing extrajudicial killings, right? So in other words, there are 60% of Filipinos support Duterte even if they know he is a murderer, right? I would rather be elitist and condemn that 60% than be populist and say, oh, it's okay because this is what the masses say, right? I would rather be elitist and keep my principles and say, there is something morally wrong with what is happening in my country, right? And, I will, for example, it saddens me, for example, that Reynaldo Ileto, who wrote about subaltern mentalities, has in certain interviews defended Duterte based on the premise that he is supported by the people and that this anti-Americanism resonates with the popular will of the people, right? I mean, Ileto has not explicitly said, I support Duterte, but he has said certain things that sometimes make you feel like he's sympathetic to that. And I think that that's one clear case of populist thinking, populist academic thinking, giving succor to populist thinking on the ground. It's a very clear link.
Great. We have time for a few more questions, so go ahead and put those in the chat or raise your hand if you have any. All right, so I'm not seeing any more questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Claudio, for your talk today. We're so glad that you could come and speak for SEASSI and really glad you could accept that invitation. I just want to put a final plug for our upcoming SEASSI lecture as well to everyone who came today. We'll have more lectures throughout the summer, and the next one will be our Whistler Student Conference keynote. I'll just put the link in the chat in case anyone is interested. And thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, Leiloi, thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you. Thank you,
See you
everyone.
soon.
Salamat. Thank you.
Yep,
Bye. Gonna log out now.
Yep, sige.
Bye.